We'll just get this afternoon breakout session started. My name is Deanna. I'm on the board here at Timothy, and I'm Karen. And I'm just happy to introduce you to Elizabeth. Oh, no.
Urbanowicz.
I had it right for the first session.
So great. I always tell people that I'm not married, so I have a horrible last name. So it was like, I'm praying that if marriage isn't God's plan for me, oh man, short last name.
Do you hear that, anyone? Bring her to Canada. Sorry. So Elizabeth is a follower of Jesus Christ who is passionate about equipping the children with the truth of the Christian worldview. She holds a BS from Gordon College in elementary education in Spanish and an MS Ed from Northern Illinois University in literacy and education and an MA in Christian apologetics from Biola University. Elizabeth began her professional career teaching at an elementary Christian school, and now she works full-time developing comparative worldview and apologetics resources for children. Her goal is to prepare the next generation to be lifelong critical thinkers and, most importantly, lifelong disciples of Jesus. So today she'll be walking us through this topic, helping kids confront cultural issues with truth and love. So thank you very much.
See all of you here this afternoon, and it's always encouraging as a speaker to see some familiar faces. Because when my mom asked me, okay, so how did it go? I'm like, well, there was a few people that came back, so it wasn't a complete bomb. So I'm glad to see new faces and some familiar ones. So before we begin our time together this afternoon, we're just going to lay this time before the Lord. So if you pray with me, please. Father, we thank you so much for the privilege that it is to work with the children that you've placed in our care. Lord, we thank you so much for who you are. We thank you for reconciling us to yourself. Lord, we know that each of us comes into this room today just with different worries in our hearts and our minds. And Lord, I thank you that you are sovereign, that we know that we can trust you. I just ask that over the next hour that you would quiet our hearts and our minds, that your Holy Spirit would be at work, just illuminating the things that you want us to walk away with. Lord, I ask that you would guide my words, that anything that's not from you would just fall to the side. And I ask, Lord, just for all of the children that are represented by their faces in this room, Lord, we thank you for them, the gift that they are. We ask that you would be pursuing them, that they would feel the weight of their sin, that they would turn from that sin, repent of it, and trust in you, Lord, and that they would joyfully enter into your mission of reconciling the world to yourself. We love you, Lord, and we pray all these things in Jesus' name. So we're going to talk today about how we can equip the children that God has placed in our care to actually navigate the culture and engage it with both grace and truth. And as Deanna mentioned, my background is in elementary education. I spent the first decade of my career as an elementary educator in a Christian school, and it was during my years teaching that I saw a problem. That the students in my class came from very Christian homes. I was giving them a biblically based education all day long, and they were still rapidly absorbing ideas in the culture without question. You know, as Brett described culture this morning like that ocean that we all swim in. You know, and sometimes we don't even realize it because we've just been swimming in it our whole lives. However, I think over the past decade, as adults, as Christian adults, we've started to see that even though God is unchanging and His Word is unchanging, what we do to equip these children that He's placed in our care to understand the truth of the biblical worldview, that does have to change a little bit in how we equip them. I don't know if you're familiar with the old 1950s TV show I Love Lucy. One of my favorite all-time shows. I just love Lucille Ball's physical comedy. And this picture is actually from the most famous I Love Lucy episode. It's the job switching episode where Lucy and Ethel, they switch jobs, and they go out to work, and Ricky and Fred stay at home. And in this scene, Lucy and Ethel are placed in the candy factory on the conveyor belt. And there's these candies that are coming down the conveyor belt, and their job is to take each candy and wrap it in a little piece of, I don't know, like paper. And then they move it down the conveyor belt, and it goes off into the boxing department. And at first, it's going pretty well. They twist it, and it goes, and they're like, I got the hang of this. Well, all of a sudden, their supervisor comes in and goes, speed it up a little, and the conveyor belt starts moving faster. And there are candies coming down this conveyor belt faster than they can grab them. And soon they just start scooping with their arms, shoving, not wrapping the candies, they start shoving them down their blouses, in their hats, in their mouths, and eventually Lucy looks at Ethel and goes, Ethel, I think we're fighting a losing game. And sometimes that's what it feels like in this cultural moment. Because parenting has always been challenging. Because the minute that you feel like, okay, I got down this stage of parenting, they move on to the next. And you're like, how unfair is that? I just got this one down and they moved on. And then when your next child comes, you're like, okay, I got this down. I remember what it was like to work with a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old. And they're a completely different child that is completely different. And you're like, this is so unfair. So from that end of the spectrum, you're having this constantly changing child. But then we have this continuously changing culture. And it's like, oh my goodness, how could we have anticipated 15 years ago that TikTok was going to exist? Or that every single child in our child's grade level was going to have an iPhone and the whole world was going to have access to them. And you know what, who knows, 5 years from now, if this conference takes place again in 2028, who knows what social media platforms will exist? Who knows what the new iPhone will be like? And so we sometimes can just feel like we are fighting a losing game. Because as I mentioned before, we know God's word never changes. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. God never changes. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But our culture is rapidly changing. And as I mentioned in the previous session that I led, in 1 year of our kids' lives, they're going to be faced with more competing ideas than most humans throughout the course of human history have had to face in their entire lives. So we do not know what is coming down the pipeline. We don't know. We're already intimidated by what we do know is already here. And so there's no way in which we could possibly pre-prepare our children for everything they are going to face. But what I'm going to recommend in this session is that rather than trying to directly prepare them for every single idea that they are going to encounter, what we can do is give them transferable skills, these baseline skills that they can implement in any and every situation in life. For those of you who are married, think about the conflicts you get in with your spouse. You don't know every single conflict that you're going to get into. Yes, you have those repeated ones that come up, week after week. But you don't know every single conflict you're going to get into. But if you have some baseline agreements of, you know what, when I'm feeling really stressed, we're going to take 5 minutes, just a 5-minute break. And you know what, then I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask some questions to try to really hear my spouse, rather than just throwing out, like what I think is true. I'm going to ask some questions, to try to really hear him or try to really hear her. And then, you know what, after that, we're going to have an agreement that we're not going to raise our voices and we're not going to name call. You don't know every single conflict you and your spouse are going to get into from now until death do you part. But if you have some basic skills that you can take with you in every and any conflict, things are going to go much smoother. And it's the same way with our kids and what they're going to prepare, or what they're going to encounter in culture. So even though I'm actually a speaker today, I'm still very much a teacher. Like any good teacher, I have a goal for our time together. And my goal is that by the end of this hour, we would be able to articulate, I can't even articulate that word, articulate 4 steps needed to equip our children to engage the culture with grace and truth. And so that is my goal for us. If you were in my previous session, you know that I like to give lots and lots of practical examples. It's just the teacher in me. But I don't want to be inspired, I want to be equipped. Okay, there can be inspiration involved with equipping. But I want you to leave here today with some steps that you can implement on Monday. So this session, just as a warning, this session is going to be a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose. And this is actually a fire hydrant, sorry. Firefighting equipment mix. It's going to be a little bit like drinking out of a fire hydrant. Here's what I would recommend for you. As you're going through this with me, and we're covering 4 steps, think about what is one thing. One thing you can take away and implement with your children, or with your ministry context, or in your classroom in the coming weeks. Because the plan that I'm going to lay out is very systematic. It's something that we do at Foundation World, the organization that I run, how we run our curriculums. Okay, so everything I present, you're not going to be able to, okay, I got to remember all those steps and I got to do all this. Choose one thing, okay? So that's just fair warning. The fire hydrant is about to be unleashed. Try to pay attention to one thing. Okay, so the first step that we really need to do Those of you who were in my last session, you're like, we already know this. I know, we're just going to cover it really quickly. We need to train our children to discern objective truth claims from subjective preference claims. Okay, so for those of you who are in the last one, this is the same thing. I'm going to say it again because it's so important, because we live in this culture that really confuses personal preference with objective truth. And those are two completely different things. So when you think of objective, think of this motion. It's outside of us. So an objective claim is anything that my feelings cannot control. My inner world cannot control. It's outside of the control of that. And those claims are either true or false. Subjective means anything that's inside of me that I can control. So in the last session, I went over how we tend to have this dichotomy of fact and opinion. But I don't think it's the best dichotomy, because in our world, facts are supposedly not anything except for things that can be scientifically conclusively proven. Where, I mean, most of life just isn't like that. Okay, there's many things that we know are true that, like, we can't take into a scientific laboratory and conclusively prove that. Think about your love for your children. You can't prove in a test tube that you love your children, that your love is real, because love is metaphysical, it's intangible. However, there's lots of evidences that support the claim you love your child. Okay, it's not just your opinion. So the dichotomy that I suggested in the last one is we create this objective, subjective dichotomy. It's either something that's outside of the control of our emotions, and it's either true or false, or it's subjective. It's our personal preference or taste. And the example I gave in the last session, really easy that you can do with older kids, like anybody 8 on up, bake cookies or just bring cookies in and say, okay, we're going to talk about these cookies. What are some sentences describing these cookies that are objective, like they're either true or false? Saying these cookies have chocolate chips in them, it's either true or false. Either the cookies have chocolate chips or they don't have chocolate chips. Saying these cookies are gluten-free, it's either true or false. Either the cookies have gluten or they don't have gluten in them. Saying these cookies were baked in my house, that's either true or it's not true. Either they were baked in my house or they were baked in another location. And then say, okay, now I want us to think of some sentences that are subjective. The truth of them is just going to be based on someone's personal preference. I look at these cookies, I think I'm weird. I look at these cookies and I say, ew, gross. I'm very weird and chocolate does not taste good to my taste buds. I think chocolate is disgusting. I would never, ever, ever, ever. If you ever see me on Facebook writing, I love chocolate, it means I have been kidnapped. Come help me. Okay? So I would never take a handful of M&Ms. Most people would say, look at these and say, ooh, yum. Okay? Or they might say, oh, these cookies are just right. These cookies are too small. These cookies are not worth the calories. These cookies were in the oven for too long. Those are personal preference sentences. The little guys, the example I gave last time is give them sentences about puppies and say, I'm going to give you some sentences. If that sentence is a true sentence, I want you to spread out your arms and yell true. And if that sentence is not true, I want you to press your arms like an X and say not true. And if that sentence is a feeling, I want you to hug yourself and say feeling. And then give them simple sentences like puppies are baby dogs. True. Puppies are, sorry, I just lost my, pups are, I was like, I lost my sentence. Puppies fly in the air. Silly, that's not true. And then puppies are fun. That's a feeling, because some people feel like puppies are very fun. Other people, when a puppy's chewing on their shoe or the arm of the sofa, do not feel like puppies are very fun. Okay, so these are just some really practical activities, because we want them to understand the difference between something that's objective and is either true or false, or something that is subjective, that is just a personal preference. We want to create these categories in their mind, because think about all the information our children are digesting. If we can give them these categories, did that TikToker, or did that person on YouTube, or did that Disney Plus video just make a claim that's objective, like it's either true or false, or did they just share their preference with me? Which, that's nice, that's not going to change anything about me. And so we want them to ask this question, is this person sharing their preference, or are they making a truth claim? We want them always to be asking that. Is this person sharing their preference, or are they making a truth claim? If they're sharing their preference, great, good for them. Doesn't change anything about me. If they're making a truth claim, I have a responsibility. I have to determine, is what they said true, or is it not true? Okay, a good example of this, I'm not needing to pick on spouses here, but just think about when you get into a fight with your spouse or an argument with your spouse, and then you're talking with them afterwards. You can make this claim and say, that was hurtful. That was hurtful. That's not a bad thing to say, sharing with them how you felt, but that is subjective. What your spouse just said to you might not have hurt somebody else, but it hurt you, and it's important for you to share that. Okay? So that's a subjective claim. It might not have been hurtful to somebody else. But if you say, that was wrong, you're making an objective claim. You're not saying, that personally hurt me. You're saying, when you said that to me, that was actually morally wrong. So we have to start thinking about what kind of language are we using. Are we using subjective language or objective language? I'm not saying go around telling your spouse that they're wrong. Okay, I'm just saying that in an argument, those are two different claims. The first one is, this is how this made me feel. The next one is, you actually did something that needs to be repented of and changed. Another situation in our society, just think about the revolution of gender and sexuality. Okay, when somebody says, I feel like a man trapped in a woman's body, that's a subjective claim. They're sharing how they feel. Okay, and when we hear something like that, our response should be to ask questions. It's interesting, can you tell me more about that? How long have you felt like that? Is that a feeling you enjoy? Is that a feeling that's hard for you? How have different people responded to that? Okay, so someone's making a claim about how they're feeling. It's a subjective claim, and we can ask more questions to get to know them. When somebody actually claims, I am a man trapped in a woman's body, that's a completely different claim. They're not sharing how they're feeling, they're making an objective claim, which is saying, I actually am a man who is trapped inside of a woman's body. That's an identity claim, it's an objective claim. Again, that claim should elicit questions. That's interesting. How long have you felt that way? What makes you think that's true? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Okay, but those are two different kinds of claims. The first one is just subjective, someone's sharing their feeling. This is an identity claim. It's objective. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why we want to give our kids these categories. In the last session, I shared a story about how someone wrote into our ministry that once their 7-year-old had been trained to think of the difference between true, not true, and feeling, that 7-year-old boy had a substitute teacher who was a transgender woman, so a man who was identifying as a woman. He was dressed as a woman, he went by a woman's name, Ms. So-and-so, and when that 7-year-old got in the car that afternoon, and the mom was just like, oh, how was your school day? And he was explaining this, she was saying she was trying not to freak out, because they hadn't had a conversation about transgenderism yet. And she was just like, oh, so tell me, what did you think about that? And he said, Mommy, I just thought it was so sad because Ms. So-and-so is not believing the truth. The truth is that his body is a boy's body. He's instead believing his feelings and thinking his feelings are the truth, where feelings are different than truth. So by laying that framework, okay, didn't have to have a conversation about transgenderism. Didn't have to do a lot of backpedaling when her son came home and she was like, oh my gosh, what just happened for the last 8 hours in school? Because he had that framework. He was, at 7 years old, on his own, able to make that distinction. Okay, so the second thing we need to do, that first thing we need to equip them to understand the difference between objective truth claims and subjective preference claims. The second thing we need to do is directly teach them careful thinking rules. If you've been trained in logic and critical thinking, these are basically the laws of logic. With kids, I just like to call them the careful thinking rules because it's just rules for how they can think well. Because that's a mistake that we've made a lot in our Western education system. We think we need to cram them full of content. They need to know this, and 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 they need to know this. We can know a lot just by Googling something. These days, what's really much more valuable is learning how to think. Because if you learn how to think, rather than being pumped full of what to think, you're going to go much further in life and you're going to be much more grounded in the truth. Because rather than being like, okay, I heard it, now I memorized it and regurgitated it. I heard it, now I memorized it and regurgitated it. I heard it, now I memorized and regurgitated. You're actually stopping and saying, wait a minute, I just heard that, and that doesn't make any sense. whatsoever. So the first careful thinking rule, the first law of logic, I like to put it this way for kids. Something is what it is, and it's not something else. Something is what it is, and it's not something else. And you might be thinking, I didn't get to come to this session on the battlist. I haven't known that since I was born. Well, yes, to a certain degree, but think about language. Think about this word, love. When we use the word love in a conversation, a lot of times we're talking past the other person. Because as Christians, we know what the biblical definition of love is. We know that God is love. We know that greater love has no one than this, than that someone should lay down their life for their friends. We know 1 Corinthians 13, what love is. So a great way to summarize that is to say that love is giving of ourselves to do what is best for another. Giving of ourselves for the good of another. Even if that means harming ourselves, because the greatest example of love, Jesus' sacrifice for us. We can't even imagine how painful that was, but that was genuine love. Well, then think about what is the definition that our culture uses. Our culture is saying love is love, which technically when we're just looking at semantics, we can agree. Love is equivalent to love. Okay, like Elizabeth Urbanowicz is equivalent to Elizabeth Urbanowicz. This MacBook Pro is equivalent to this MacBook Pro. But when people say love is love, how are they defining love? Not giving of ourselves for the good of another. Our culture means unreservedly celebrating the sexual proclivities of another. That's what our culture means. So when we're talking about the word love with someone, we're often talking past them. This was several years ago now because in 2015 was the Roosevelt decision in the United States when same-sex marriage became legal in all 50 states. So this was before 2015. I was living just outside of Chicago. I was in downtown Chicago, and I was waiting for a friend, and just along Michigan Avenue, and I was approached by a young man who was a nice young man, very flamboyant. He was like, "Excuse me, miss, do you believe in equal rights for everyone?" And I was like, "Oh gosh, I know where this is going." And I was like, this is like a lose-lose situation, because I say yes, then he's like, great, and here is my gay rights, marriage pamphlet. And if I say no, I'm like, great, how hateful do I sound? So instead, I said, that's a really interesting question. I was like, before I answer that, can you just explain to me what you mean by equal rights? Because I wanted to know, I was like, okay, something is what it is and it's not something else. If we're talking about something different when we say equal rights, he's like, oh yes. And then he said, do you believe that people should be able to love whoever they want to love? Again, I'm like, okay, we're talking past one another. I was like, well, technically, yes, but it depends on what your definition of love is. I was like, so can you share with me your definition of love? And we had a good conversation. But we have to equip our children to understand something is what it is and it's not something else. So when someone uses a word and we're not sure how they're using that word, we have to ask good questions. Because think about other words, like tolerance. The classic definition of tolerance is vehemently disagreeing with the idea of another person, but still choosing to respect them as a person. What is the modern day definition of tolerance? Whoa, if you do not celebrate every part about me, you are intolerant. Where that's a completely opposite definition. Or sometimes even think about the word faith. When we look biblically at what faith is, we see that God continually asks his people to put their trust in him, who we cannot see, because everything we can see points to him. And in Scripture, God never asks for blind faith. He asks for evidence-based trust. Think about it. Jesus didn't come out of nowhere and ask Peter to get out of the boat and walk on the water. Think of all Peter had been through with Jesus before Jesus said, come out. Okay, he didn't ask for blind faith. Peter should have had evidence-based trust with all the miracles he saw in Jesus' ministry, and then the fact that Jesus was actually standing on top of the water when he called him out. But we often get confused and just buy into this cultural thing that faith is just wishful thinking. You know what? If I believe it, I can achieve it. Okay, we need to make sure that our children, the children in our care, understand whenever someone is using the word, in a really important conversation, we need to make sure we understand how is that person using that word. And it takes time. It takes time. But these are things, around the dinner table, in the classroom, in the Sunday school room, in the youth group. We can actually go through this, okay? Let's look at this word. Let's look at some different passages of Scripture. Okay, according to Scripture, how is this word defined? How have we seen this word defined sometimes in culture? You can bring up different examples and just talk through, okay, so when somebody brings up the word love, we're probably going to have to ask them what they mean by that. We're probably going to have to ask them some questions. The second rule of careful thinking is a claim cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same way. So something cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same way. This is where it gets tricky, because technically it is true that the lights in this classroom are off right now. But it's also true that the lights in this classroom are on, but I'm not talking about the same time and the same way. The lights in this middle section and the front half of this room are off, where the lights over here on the right side are on. So we have to make sure we're talking about in the same time and in the same way. Something can't be both true and false. So this is where things come in, like when we're talking about Jesus' resurrection. It can't be true for me and not true for you. It can't be true that Jesus rose from the grave and true that Jesus did not rise from the grave. Jesus rose from the grave, or he did not rise from the grave. So think about a sentence like this. It is wrong to judge. Okay, let's think about what this sentence is saying. Well, the word judge means to determine that something is right or wrong. Okay, so to judge is to determine something is right or wrong. So this sentence is telling us it is morally wrong to say that something is morally right or wrong. Okay, did you see how this sentence is both saying that it is right, because you can declare that it's wrong, and that it's wrong? It's saying that judgment is both right and wrong at the same time and in the same way. This sentence is what we call a self-defeater. Because if this sentence is true, it's also false. So we want to just prepare our kids for these things that sound really good, but are self-defeating. Or think about this sentence. Truth is subjective. Okay, it's a feeling, it's a personal preference. Okay, if this sentence is true, then it's actually also false. Because I don't have to believe it. Because if it's true that all truth is subjective, well, that's just your personal preference. And I don't need to believe that. So we want to prepare our kids just for these things in our culture that are going to sound really good, but we want them to listen and like, wait a minute, what did that person just say? What words did they use? Can this sentence stand on its own, or does it actually defeat itself? So first, something is what it is and it's not something else. This is a claim can't be both true and false at the same time and in the same way. And then the third rule is a claim is either true or false. There is no third option. So when we're talking about objective claims, there are two choices. Either it is true or it is false. There's no third option. And this is where we can really help our kids see that Christianity is not just some personal, subjective belief system. When we're talking about God's Word, the Bible, either the Bible was inspired by God or the Bible was not inspired by God. There is no third option. Now, that doesn't mean automatically that the Bible was inspired by God. We have to have a conversation, multiple conversations probably around that. But it can't be just like, oh, yeah, that's nice, the Bible is true for you. It's like, no, either the Bible is true and presents an accurate picture of reality, or it's false and does not present an accurate picture of reality. There is no third option. The same is true with the central claim of Christianity. Jesus rose from the grave. Either Jesus rose from the grave, or he did not rise from the grave. And this is something that is so confused in our culture. Every other year, Ligonier Ministries in the U.S. does what they call their State of Theology report, and they interview a whole bunch of different Christians of all different denominations and backgrounds and ages, and then they compile a report on their beliefs. And in their 2022 report, they found that 46% of 18 to 30-year-old evangelical Christians in the United States that they surveyed agreed that God accepts the worship of all religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So close to half of those who are claiming that they believe that Jesus is the only way to God is the only way to God for Christians. Because if you know anything about Judaism and Islam, you know that Judaism, Islam, and Christianity cannot all be true. They could logically all be false. It's logically possible that they're all false. But it's not logically possible that they're all true. Because Judaism and Christianity have a lot of the same tenets and the same historical foundation. Judaism teaches that the Messiah has not yet come. So Jesus was not the Messiah, where Christianity teaches that Jesus is the only Messiah. So either Jesus is the Messiah, or he's not the Messiah. There's no third middle ground option. And then with Islam specifically says, in the Quran, it specifically says that God has no son. Okay, he is not three. There is only one God, which we agree there's only one God, but we agree that there's one God in three persons. So either Jesus is the Son of God, or he is not the Son of God. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam cannot all be true. And that's something we want to make sure we're helping our children understand. There's no third option in here. Okay, so first we covered that we need to make sure our children know the difference between objective truth claims and subjective preference claims. And we talked about making sure that they know the rules for careful thinking. We just talked about those. And remember, just as a reminder, I know this is a hard session because this is right after lunch, it's very hot in this room, and all of the blood is rushing to your stomach to digest your food. Remember, this is a fire hydrant. As you're going through all this, just focus on, okay, Lord, what's one thing I can take and implement this week. The third thing is we need to equip them to recognize mistakes in careful thinking. Because a lot of the videos they're going to see on TikTok and on YouTube, a lot of the conversations they're going to have with people in culture, a lot of the things they're going to see on streaming shows are people making grave errors in careful thinking. Now, there are many logical fallacies, which are mistakes in careful thinking. I would have you here until midnight if we're going to go through all of them. So we're just going to cover a few very popular ones. So one that we want to make sure that our children understand is that a person's character does not make his claim true or false. A person's character does not make his claim true or false. There are a lot of very nice people out there spouting untrue ideas. And there's a lot of real jerks teaching truth. Okay? Not saying we want to model our character after the jerks, but just because they're a jerk doesn't mean what they claim is false. And conversely, we want to make sure, especially in this age of our kids actually watching people who are influencers, that just because somebody is really, really nice doesn't mean what they say is true. We can appreciate that that person is nice. We can say, you know what? I want to be kind like that person, or I want to be winsome like that person. That is completely different than whether or not what they are teaching is true. So we want to make sure that our kids understand this. Niceness does not equal truth. Rudeness does not equal untruth. This was a fun example from a YouTube interview that I did where I shared the fact that I do not like chocolate, and so this was a comment that was put, she doesn't like chocolate chip cookies? How could she be deemed trustworthy? So it's just a funny one. So someone's like, oh my gosh, she doesn't like chocolate, how can we trust anything she says? So that's just a fun example. Where the next example I'm going to show you a picture of the podcast that we do on YouTube, because you're going to need to see this picture. So we did a recent podcast, and this was on help somebody, we answer questions on the podcast, and somebody wrote in, how do I help develop a worldview that accepts the supernatural, where my kids don't just think that the physical is all there is. And somebody wrote in with this comment, young children already believe in agency of stuff they don't understand. When my daughter was 3, she was terrified of a hot air balloon that was filling pre-launch. She thought it was a monster. Sharing your supernatural with a child is child abuse. You're telling them to keep believing in invisible spooks and specters, aka lies, Stunting a child's development in abstract and rational thinking should never be encouraged, but I expect nothing less from a grown adult who has her books arranged by color. So, that's why I needed to show you the picture up there. So the funny thing about this is, think about what we've already just talked about. Okay, the word child abuse, we're going to need to define. How is that being defined right there? Because that's a pretty wide claim, and we're talking about two different things. Because when I use the term child abuse, I'm talking about someone physically, sexually, or emotionally harming a child. They're talking about teaching a child Christianity. Okay, two different things. Then, also talks about, this is the confusing character with content from a grown adult who has her books arranged by color. The thing I found really interesting about this, though, is in that same sentence, talked about rational thinking. This is so interesting, that this person is claiming that they are the rational thinker, and then they're confusing my book arrangement preferences with what I'm saying. And so now this is a funny example, but this is an example of something real, and something that does happen. And now my immediate reaction, first I was so frustrated, I'm like, oh, I'm so tired of YouTube comments like that. Then I kind of laughed when I saw this, but then the next response, I was like, you know what, Lord, this person is so lost, and this person is angry at you, I don't know why. I don't know this person's history, but obviously things have happened that have made this person very angry at you. And so I just spent time praying for this person, that God would awaken them to the truth. And those are the kind of things we want to take our kids through examples like this, but then also spend time praying for the people who are deceived, because we don't want to develop really intelligent jerks. Okay, we don't want that. We don't want our kids going around being like, oh, I know how to think so well. Oh my gosh, nobody else knows how to think so well. And that can very easily happen, when we teach our children how to think well. So that was the first mistake. The second mistake we're going to talk about is feelings are not support. Feelings are not evidence. Now I hope that as I'm up here presenting today that I'm an engaging speaker. Okay, I'm hoping that the way that I'm using my tone of voice, my body language, the examples, all that kind of stuff, I hope it's engaging. But my engagement with you has nothing to do with whether or not I'm teaching the truth. I could also stand up here all day and say, okay, what are we talking about? How we're going to birthdays and I can spread like this. It'd probably be a lot more boring, but it wouldn't change whether what I'm saying is true or false. And so we need to make sure that our children understand this, so that when we're there watching a very passionate YouTuber, or a very passionate politician, or a very passionate teacher, or a very passionate friend, that they can listen to that person, but they have to be asking themselves, what is that person saying? Are they making objective claims, or are they making subjective claims? Do their claims that are objective, do they follow the rules of careful thinking? Because they can have somebody talking really, really passionately about something, but someone's passion for something doesn't make it true or false. I think a great example of this is Greta Thunberg, or however you pronounce her last name. I'm not trying to say taking care of the environment is not important. If you're not familiar with her, she's a very young climate activist from somewhere in Scandinavia. I think she's Swedish, she might be Norwegian, I can't remember. But anyway, basically the way she got famous and the way she got her picture on the cover of Time magazine was she basically went around and she would go to large groups of people and she'd be like, you ruined my childhood! And she would just scream about how her childhood was ruined because the environment was being ruined, and she would cry and rant and rage, and then she got her picture on the cover of Time magazine. But feelings do not equal support. She may have been speaking some things that were true about the environment. She may have been saying some things that were not true, but it doesn't matter that she's up there crying and throwing a fit as a young teenager. Her claims are either true or false. Her emotions have nothing to do with whether or not her claims are true. We also need to be careful of this, though, in church. Because think about sometimes what churches do. And now I know I'm going to step on some toes here, and I actually am meaning to step on toes. That's not true. I am meaning to step on toes. I'm not meaning to make anybody angry, but I think this is something we really have to think about. God has created us as emotional beings. He has. The Psalms make that very clear. And our worship of God can be very passionate. And we can have very deep emotional experiences with God. But those have to be true experiences with God. We're so often, think about, I actually haven't ever been to a Canadian church, so I cannot speak to Canadian churches. I can tell you what's happening in the U.S. I would assume it's pretty similar to what's happening up here. Usually when churches build new buildings, the room that they call the sanctuary or the worship center, it has no windows. Why is that? Because it's better for controlling the lighting and the sound. You can lower the lights to help create a more calming and emotional environment. And then, the pastor gets up there and prays, and then halfway through the song, you hear the first note on the guitar, and then it keeps going. And I'm not trying to say music is a bad thing. Music is a gift from God. We're to use it for His glory. We are to sing praises to God. But so often in the church, we try to fabricate emotional experiences with God. And again, we can have emotional experiences with God. That is not what church leadership is called to do. Church leadership is called to faithfully preach the Word of God so that Jesus' name might be lifted high. We as the congregation are called to sing praises to God so that we are magnifying and lifting His name high, and we are speaking truth over our own souls. So often, what are modern worship songs? Lord, this is how I respond to you. This is how I respond to you. This is how I feel about you. It's not necessarily what we need. I focus on my feelings enough already. I kind of need some truth about who God is. So I'm just saying, just be careful. I'm not saying you have to go punch holes in your church's walls or in the natural light. But if the church is building a new building, you may want to bring up, shouldn't we have some natural revelation come in? Some sunlight. So we need to be careful that our kids understand that their feelings about God are going to go up and down. They are. And when we have really positive feelings and emotional experiences, it doesn't mean they're not real. That's not what our faith rests on. Our faith doesn't rest on the emotions. We get to enjoy those emotions or not enjoy them many times, but our faith is grounded in the objective truth of Jesus' resurrection. The last mistake in careful thinking that we're going to cover today is popularity does not equal truth. Popularity does not equal truth. And this is where it's difficult, because again, like Brett was talking about, we're swimming in this culture, and when everybody else is swimming a certain way, we're just like, oh yeah, this is what I'm supposed to do. We're doggy paddling, not realizing that there's other strokes that we could do that would actually get us somewhere faster. Think about, I'm assuming since this was popular in the United States, it was also popular in Canada, the Tide Pod. Like, oh my gosh, like we have these teenagers swallowing poison because everybody's doing it, okay? So there was this craze online where when Tide Pods were invented, there was a challenge to swallow Tide Pods, okay? When you swallow detergent, what happens to your organs? They start shutting down, okay? So just because something is popular does not mean it is true. And so it's kind of like that, if everybody else walked off a bridge, would you walk off a bridge? But it's true. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's true. It's also true with things that we believe is true. For example, most people in the world believe that the world is round. Most people believe it. Well, why do you believe that Earth is round? Do you believe it because everybody else believes it? Because if that's why you believe it, you shouldn't be believing it then. We need actual evidence why we believe something. And so just because everybody believes Earth is round doesn't mean that's the grounding for our basis. Do I believe Earth is round? Yes, I do. But I believe it because of the scientific evidence, not because everybody around me believes that. And so it's the same way with Christianity. We want to make sure we can actually ask our kids, if we have older kids, do you believe that the Bible is true? Do you believe that Jesus actually rose from the grave? Do you believe that Christianity is the true view? And our kids don't have to answer yes. We want to hear the truth, because if they don't believe it's true, that's eventually going to come out. And when do we want it to come out? When they're off in the university? When they have their first job? No, we want it to come out now. We want to ask them that. And even if they say yes, then we can ask them why. Why do you believe that it's true? Because we need to actually have reasons for believing it's true. And if you're sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, Elizabeth, I don't know why I believe Christianity is true, that's okay. And I'm not saying stay there, it's not okay, just stay there, but it's okay if you're in that place right now. But just have this as a wake-up call that I better actually investigate this and get some solid ground underneath my feet for understanding why Christianity is true. The fourth thing that we need to do is actually where we get into the engaging part. So the first three things that we covered were all about training our children with transferable skills they can use in any and every situation, so to make sure that they understand what is true. But as I said, we don't want to create little arrogant jerks. We want to help foster, again, only God causes regeneration, causes rebirth. We cannot create Christian kids. Okay, only God can cause new birth. But we can help foster an understanding that Christianity is true, and we can help foster their character along the way. So the fourth thing I'm recommending is that we need to practice listening well and asking good questions. Listening well and asking good questions. And if you do this, there's some positives and negatives. If you train your children to listen well, you might just have some much better conversations and much better relationships. And when you train them to ask good questions, they're going to start asking you really good questions. And you need to be prepared for it, but it's worth it. There's a reason that in the book of James, God tells us to be quick to hear and slow to speak. And that's because ever since Genesis 3, we've been programmed the exact opposite. We are very quick to speak and very slow to hear. Most of the time, we're thinking, when someone else is talking, we're thinking about the next thing that we are going to say. We're not actually listening. And even if we are trying to listen, we don't tend to ask good questions. We tend to just jump to the next thing. So here's an activity you can do with any age group. You can even do this with your spouse if you might love your marriage. Suggest that you get a tennis ball, or if you have children that love chucking tennis balls at people's heads, get like a softer ball. But something that can be rolled across the floor. Then break your kids up in pairs, or if you just have one child, or if you just want to work in this with your child individually, sit across the room from your child and have a bowl of questions, just random questions. What's your favorite family memory? You know, what do you enjoy about school? What's one thing that kind of confuses you about Christianity? Just questions that you can ask them and that they can ask you. And have the first person, the person who has the tennis ball, pick a question out of the bowl and read the question. So they ask the question to the person across the room, okay, like, what's your favorite family memory? And then roll the ball across the floor. When that person picks up the ball, they answer the question. They answer the question and they roll the ball back. When that initial person gets the ball back, then what they have to do is they have to rephrase what they heard that person say and say, so what I heard you say was, and rephrase that. Like, so what I heard you say is that your favorite family memory is when we went out for ice cream. Then say, is that correct? And roll the ball back. That second person picks up the ball. If they were heard correctly, they say, yes. And then they pick up a question out of the bowl, read it, and start it over again. If they were misheard, they say, no, you misunderstood me. I said that my favorite family memory is the game that we played in the minivan after we went out for ice cream because I really thought that was fun. Then they roll the ball back. The first person said, oh, so what I heard you say this time is your favorite family memory is our game in the minivan. Is that correct? They roll it back. Yes, that's correct. Sometimes it might take 3 or 4 times before you understand it correctly. But a game like this, even though it might not be the most fun thing in the entire world, a game like this is really helpful in developing active listening skills. That we're training our children to really listen to the other person, and not just listen to their words, but actually to make sure that they have heard that other person correctly. Because if we want our children to actually one day engage the culture, and participate with the world around them, we need to make sure that they have these communication skills, that they're really understanding the other person. Try that with your spouse and be shocked at how much your communication really improves. My friend Hillary Ferrer from Mama Bear Apologetics, she was telling me one time, she's like, you know, the funny thing is, every time John and I get into an argument, she's like, we'll argue for an hour and then we'll start to ask questions. And the weird thing is we realize we're both arguing for the same thing. We're just using different words. She's like, so that time is shortening with each year of our marriage. We get to that point where we start asking questions sooner. She's like, but it's crazy how much of our life we've wasted arguing without even asking each other questions to realize we're on the same side in this. So that's the first thing. That's the first activity that we can do to just help our children really start to develop some active listening skills. Then for questions, we want to teach them good questions to ask. A good question is, can you tell me what you mean by that? Can you tell me what you mean by that? And I can tell you, standing up here, even though I'm teaching this, these are skills that I still need a lot of work in. I still need a lot of growth in this. And recently I've just been praying, God, help me to grow in this, because I'm an introvert naturally, meaning that interactions with others, while I love them, they take a lot of energy out of me. On top of that, I also live on my own and work for myself. So I have a lot more alone time than most people. And so actually engaging in conversation with others, it does take a lot out of me. And so I've just been praying recently, God, can you help me be more intentional at listening well and asking good questions? And so just in different relationships that I've had, I've tried to ask this question more often, even just in simple conversations where we might not be talking about a big worldview issue, but someone will just share with me something. I'll be like, wait a minute, I didn't fully catch that. Did you mean this or did you mean this? Can you tell me what you mean by that? This is a really, really helpful question. And this is something that we can practice with our kids. We can have this question and some other ones that I'm going to show you. We can just have them in another bowl of questions, or we can have them, like on a sheet on our dining room table, and we can practice having a conversation and asking one another these questions. Because that's another thing in this world of screens, where so much interaction is online. Our children actually need to be directly taught how to communicate with one another. I found this, I was actually telling Pam, my coworker who travels with me, I was telling her, it was actually my 7th year of teaching that I realized these kids no longer know how to make eye contact, say good morning, or even ask one another questions at the lunchroom. I would go in the lunchroom and everybody's sitting there eating. I'm like, oh my gosh, guys, this is your free time, talk to one another. And I did the math backwards, and I realized that starting with that 7th year, those were children who were born in 2006, which when was the iPhone invented? 2008. So those were children who basically, from their first time that they had verbal skills at the age of 2, they were surrounded by iPhones and iPads and all sorts of other technologies. So our children actually need to be directly taught these skills. Sometimes people think it's cute, like in a social setting, when somebody goes to introduce themselves to a child and the child runs and hides or puts their eyes down or is shy, oh, they're shy. No, they're actually not treating that person like an image mirror. That's actually sin, what our child is doing. Do we do that sometimes? Yes, and it's sin when we do that as well. So we need to make sure that we are teaching our kids these skills, and we're not just oh, he's shy, it's just cute. No, it is sin that we need to train our children out of. Another good question we can train them to ask is, how did you come to believe that? How did you come to believe that? Because a lot of times, people spout ideas that have very interesting origins. How they came to believe that. Because when we ask this question, how did you come to believe that? We learn a lot more about someone's history. If I had an opportunity to talk with that person who left that YouTube comment and was just in person, was just thanks for leaving your feedback. I just talked about teaching kids about God, opening them up to the supernatural. You said that was child abuse. Can you just explain to me a little more about how you came to believe that? What led you to believe that talking to kids about God is child abuse? I'm going to learn a lot of things about that person's past. A lot of things that I probably did not initially think when I first read that comment. So that's another really important question. Another one is, what convinced you that's true? This is a great one. Because when we ask this question, a lot of times what we find out, there's no support. There's no evidence. A few weeks ago, I just finished the book Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Shriver. And I posted about it on Facebook, and I said, this is a phenomenal book, moms and dads and girls, you have to read this. This is not optional, you have to read this. And somebody that I'm friends with on Facebook wrote in the comments, unfortunately, the study she based her work off is flawed. And so I just responded, I said, oh, I'm so interested to know more about that. What was flawed about the study? Was it her qualitative research or her quantitative research? Can you give me more information about that? Silence. But a claim like that is made, and it can really cause us to be like, oh wait, what are you talking about? Christianity is not true, it's all a lie. The Apostle Paul didn't really write the New Testament, it was just a bunch of people that were trying to trick us. You just gotta ask some questions. Interesting. What convinced you that is true? Because a lot of times what you find is no evidence or mistakes in careful thinking. Another one is, may I share with you what I believe is true? And that is we wait until we've asked these other questions because we want to develop a relationship with that person. And usually, not always, this is not a formula for 100% guaranteed success because people are people. And we're all different and we're all sinful. So it doesn't mean we'll have success, but a lot of times after we've asked someone a good question and really sought to know them, then if we ask this question, they'll offer us the opportunity to share with them. And so are we going to expect a 6-year-old to be able to go through this? Absolutely not. But if we start having conversations like this around the dinner table, where we ask one another questions, we're going to be training them. So one day when they are out in the world, you know, when they're 12, 14, 16, 25, 32, they're going to be prepared to ask good questions like this. And I told you at the beginning of the hour that my goal for us is that we would be able to articulate 4 steps needed to equip our children to engage the culture with truth and love. And I explained that these 4 steps, I think, are transferable skills that they can implement in any and every situation. If we continually train them to think this way, we're creating these neurological pathways that are going to stick with them and are going to go with them into any and every situation. Now, my mom, when I was growing up, she didn't do all of these things with me, but one thing she did do is every time we were watching a Disney movie, she would pause and she would explain to us why Mufasa coming back from the grave couldn't really happen and how it doesn't come from Christianity. And I was like, oh, this was the Lion King. Oh my gosh. The great thing about that is I've never asked to watch movies when friends were over. Never. But all throughout my growing up years, my mom would do that with every single movie. It was so annoying, and I would roll my eyes and I'd pretend I wasn't listening. And you know what I do now professionally as a parent? I help people train children to evaluate ideas. See, what my mom did worked. Despite all the eye rolling and despite all of the bad attitudes, my mom persisted and she taught me how to think. She did. So even if our kids don't want this, even if they grow up and they walk away from Jesus, even if that happens, we've equipped them with these skills and we can be praying that the Holy Spirit will use what we have laid in their formative years to continually bring them back to who He is. The 4 steps we went through, first was to train them to discern objective truth claims from subjective preference claims. Second thing we talked through was directly teach them careful thinking rules. We talked about those 3 rules. Something is what it is and it's not something else. A claim cannot be true and false at the same time and in the same way, and something is either true or false. There's no third option. Then, third, we talked about equip them to recognize mistakes in careful thinking. We talked about how someone's character does not make their claim true or false. We also talked about how feelings are not support. And the third one, as an imperfect human, is escaping me right now. But you can look back through your notes and go over that one. Then, fourth, we talked about practice listening well and asking good questions. We talked about the tennis ball activity, and we talked about some questions like, can you tell me what you mean by that? Or what led you to believe that's true? Or how did you come to believe that? Can I share with you what I believe is true? And remember, I told you this session, I know, was like a fire hydrant, thinking out of a fire hydrant. So what I'd love for you to think through is just what's one thing that we talked about you can start working on with the kids in your care. Because you know what? Doing one thing well is much better than doing nothing, and much better than doing 10 things poorly. So think about one thing. If you're interested in just some more resources to help you equip you to get your kids thinking this way at Foundation Worldview, we have webinars, we have podcasts, we have book clubs, and we have curriculum. So you can scan the QR code or you can go to foundationworldview.com for more information. I am going to call Deanna back up here. Also, I will stick around for probably like 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions, but I have to go on the main one to get the mic up, so I will not be here as long as I was in the last session. So,